had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there.
Okay, as we have an apparent serious oxygen leak.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Houston, we've had a problem. He's in a roll and he can't stop it.
Performing an evasive maneuver.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. I think we need to do a little more all-weather testing.
Welcome to space.
Hello and welcome to Failure to Launch, the space history podcast where we take you through all the mistakes, failures, and explosions that made modern space exploration possible. We are your hosts, Quinn,
Chris,
and a vague approximation of Chris.
And today we are joined by Dr. Andrew Jenks to talk about Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, and his incredibly weird history. So, Dr. Jenks is a professor of history at California State University, where he specializes in the history of modern Europe and Russia, as well as the history of science and the environment. His published works cover everything from Russian artists painting miniatures to examining the world's attitudes towards different ecological disasters, like Chernobyl and Bhopal. Crucially for our show, his book, The Cosmonaut Who Couldn't Stop Smiling, was the main source for our episode on the cult of Yuri Gagarin, and will be most of what we're talking about here today. Andrew, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I think we chatted about this a little bit before, but one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on, or we wanted to have you on, is because I think whenever I made the old episode on Gagarin, I had just read your book and I was a little mad at him because I figured out how much I didn't like him. So I felt like I was being a little unkind. I tried to make some different descriptors fit. Reading back through it, I kind of realized what you were driving for in that book, which is that, audience, if you take anything away from it, it's that Yuri Gagarin was a very complex, very weird dude. And I figured a great way to kind of expand on that a little bit would be to have on probably the person who has researched this element of him the most. So yeah, we're just hoping to ask you some questions and learn a little bit about, if not our favorite dude, at least our favorite weird dude. Frank Borman will forever be our favorite dude on this show.
It's kind of hard to top Frank, especially when it comes to some of his quotes.
So with the work that you had done previously, what made you want to dig into this topic and try and figure out who Yuri Gagarin was? Like, what was the initial driver there?
So I was interested in, my first, for my dissertation, I looked at a group of famous folk artists and lacquer box painters who were previously religious icon painters and what happened to them when this atheistic regime put them out of work. And they adapted themselves to look at the traditional techniques, use the traditional techniques of icon painting, religious Russian Orthodox icon painting, but applied to secular subjects, including fairy tales, but also revolutionary subjects. And one of the things I noticed in the microcosm, you might say, of the lacquer box miniature, which is a famous kind of folk art form that tourists know and that they sell in Soviet Union and later Russia, well, they adapted certain themes to their art. And after Gagarin's flight into space, he became a favorite theme inside the traditional Russian Orthodox style, but within a lacquer box. And so the microcosm, right, of the lacquer box sort of connected to the macrocosm of the cosmos through Gagarin. And I thought, wow, that's kind of cool. And so I said, well, maybe I can write a biography of Gagarin. And so I look into it, of course. No one had done it, which is understandable because of the way that the Soviet and Russian regime after the Soviet Union protected the myth and cult of Gagarin. They didn't want anyone screwing around with their sacred history, which had all sorts of political utility, not only in the Soviet period, but in the post-Soviet period. I mean, for instance, the Gagarin's feat in space exploration became one of the foundations of post-Soviet patriotism in the Putin era. So that's what got me interested in it. And so I began to develop a research agenda to figure out how to get information on him. And then eventually, after collecting that information, how to tell the story, how to narrate it, and how to deal with the fact that so much of his life was a blank slate, and intentionally made a blank slate by archivists who removed any evidence of his real self from the record so that you could only tell the heroic mythological story that the Soviets would tell ad infinitum.
I find it very interesting that you found this story from talking about artists who originally started doing religious iconography and then had to kind of translate that into the new secular Soviet state. Because it seems to me like a lot of the same thing kind of happened with Gagarin, that it's this ostensibly secular propaganda about this scientific achievement, but it quickly takes on these religious over and undertones and effectively develops into a cult.
I want to expand upon that connection to religion because there are a number of interesting connections. Despite the fact that the Soviet Bolshevik Revolution was vehemently atheistic and anti-religious, it could not cut the connection, the cultural connection, and also the mental connection to the Russian Orthodox religious world that it tried to destroy. And I think that in many ways, Gagarin was a manifestation of that. People interpreted it in religious terms. And one of the reasons they did that was if you think about the date of his flight at April 12th, 1961, that was right around Easter, which in the Russian Orthodox tradition is the most sacred Christian holiday, not Christmas, the birth of Christ, but when Christ arises. And so there was very much a connection, I think, that people, particularly, in rural areas, but also elsewhere, drew between Gagarin going into space and the arising of Christ, right? And I think that so he became a kind of Christ-like figure. And when he tragically dies in a relatively routine plane flight, that kind of seals the deal. He becomes this martyred figure and this Christ-like figure whose life was sacrificed for the nation.
Those kind of religious overtones injected into the propaganda, is that something they did intentionally, or to kind of say like, all right, well, we can't get rid of this religious thinking. What if we supplant it and replace it with Soviet religious thinking? Or was that something that just kind of happened over time?
I would tend toward the view of the latter, that it's something that happened sort of unconsciously. I mean, this is true. I mean, as an historian looking at the phenomenon of secular cults, right? And so the emergence of cult-like figures in politics occurs in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly the 20th century, at precisely that moment when religion is receding as an important component in people's lives and people's devotion and faith is redirected toward the state. So Gagarin becomes part of a secular cult, but it also, not to get too sort of into the academic weeds about it, but it has attributes of the previous religious cult, the association with Christ and with Easter, but also an association with the idea that human beings are derived from aliens. So that in the Russian tradition of cosmism, to go into space is to actually return to the cradle. As the father of Soviet Russian rocketry, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, famously put it in a quote, we are returning to the cradle, so that humans actually were alien implantations on Earth, according to a 19th century mystical mashup of science and Russian Orthodox religion. And that continued through the Soviet period and then manifested itself in the cult of Gagarin. And none of that was intentional, designed, programmed. And I think that's a fascinating thing about the cult of Gagarin is that, it was encouraged by the state, but in some ways it was created by forces that were not state directed.
I don't know if this is exactly the same kind of scenario you're describing, but I remember reading that in a lot of kind of cults, a lot of new beliefs don't actually come from top. They tend to be things that get introduced at some by lower members of the cult and then have to be adopted by the cult leader because everybody already believes this. I better play along. Especially if it's something like this building propaganda around this near mythical figure and people attributing more and more wild stories to him.
I agree with that completely, right? And even we take a sort of I don't mean to be political about this, but if we talk about the cult of Trump, right? The cult of Trump builds upon certain kind of tropes and ideas that are embedded within the population, right? This person who's going to stick it to the system in Washington, right? And to the elites from Ivy League schools that are running things, right? To the Jews, right? There are a whole bunch of sort of embedded ideas within the culture, and Trump isn't creating the cult, although he's participating in it so much as he is expressing certain desires. And I think Gagarin was kind of like that perfect combination of an expression of ideas that Russians could identify with, that turned them potentially into like a cultural phenomenon.
He essentially was the vehicle that rode the wave of that culture.
Exactly.
On our show, never worry about getting political.
Well, I want to expand. It seems like an opportunity to do so. I don't mean to sort of go out of order, but so on the religious theme and how that relates to Putin and the war against Ukraine. So I have a couple data points that strike me as part of this, the continuation of the cult of Gagarin and its political manipulation in the post-Soviet period. So in 2011, for the 50th anniversary of Gagarin's flight, and I had a friend who sent me an image that went viral in Russia. And it's an image of one of the many thousands and thousands of busts of Gagarin in a garden somewhere, right? It's just his head, right? And then it's on a pedestal. And there's, it says Yuri Gagarin, right? The 1934, 1968. But then it has scribbled some graffiti on it. And the translation of that would be, Yuri, we fucked it all up. And and I often show that to my students, but that what that expressed to me was a sense that that the people invested a certain faith in Gagarin, like Jesus Christ, and that they had failed to live up to his promise, right? Whatever that was, right? And that Russia had become weak, that it was collapsing, and all that stuff. Okay, fast forward to 2021, and in Gagarin's hometown, which I visited, interviewed a number of people. On one of the buildings, the whole place is like a museum in his honor. This little city of Gazhatsk, actually, it's named after Gagarin. The previous pre-revolutionary name, Gazhatsk, and then after Gagarin died, the city was renamed after Gagarin. So it's got this portmanteau dual name. So at any rate, there's this gigantic mural, very nicely done. And instead of saying, as that 2011 thing did, Yuri, we fucked it all up. Basically, we're sorry we didn't live up to your promise. It says, Yuri, we did it. And so what are the things that it did? This would have been in 2021 before the invasion of Ukraine. Reestablishing the oil industry. So images of vibrant oil industry, right, in this mural. Russian soldiers helping refugees in Africa, providing aid to children. We did it, right? In the name of Yuri Gagarin. And then an image of Crimea, which Russia occupied in 2014. Yuri, we did it. We took Crimea. And then an image of a Russian civilian airliner, which is a big project under Putin to revive the civilian airline industry to compete with Boeing and Airbus, which has been a dismal failure, just like the war against Ukraine. Yuri, we did it, right? That was the idea. And so by extension, you can think of the invasion of Ukraine as a kind of offering to Yuri Gagarin, right? Yuri, we did it. We took Crimea. Now we're going into Ukraine. And to me, that illustrates sort of the cultish dimensions of the Gagarin history, his image, but also the political uses to which it has been put, which have nothing absolutely to do with Gagarin himself, by the way. I mean, there's a difference between Gagarin, the human being, and Gagarin, the cult figure, just like the difference between Jesus Christ, the real historical Jesus, blood, flesh, sex, and all that stuff. And then the one that people worship in church for all sorts of different reasons.
With that in mind, do you think that, like, regardless of who Gagarin was, like, even if he was a super staunch communist, even if he was Ukrainian or Latvian, as opposed to already a pretty Russian nationalist revanchist dude, do you think that they would still be using this propaganda of him in exactly the same way? Like,
no, because if you look at the makeup of all the original cosmonaut candidates, almost all of them share certain features, and Gagarin was selected precisely because of that. And that is that they were Russian, ethnic Russian, and they tended, almost all of them, to come from the Russian provinces. So like salt of the earth, not like corrupt people that came to defeat corrupt people that came from the center in Moscow and all that. The people who came from the fresh, energetic provinces to renew the center. And so, one of the problems with the candidate that was in competition with Gagarin was a guy named German Titov, who was also salt of the earth Russian, ethnic Russian, but he had this name German, right? Titov, and that just seemed too un-Russian. And I think that may have played a critical role. It's hard to say for sure. And ultimately, the decision to go with Gagarin over Titov. Titov was the second man in space, to fly to circle the Earth. So Gagarin, I think, was selected precisely because he looked like a salt of the earth Russian provincial dude.
okay. And to kind of use that as a chance to segue into the topic. So Gagarin, he has his first flight. He flies in Vostok 1. He orbits the Earth a few times. He comes back down. Can you briefly describe for us, like, what happened fame-wise to Gagarin, like, right after this flight? So before this, were cosmonauts known and famous to the Soviet public?
So very different from the American space program, which was a response to Gagarin. If not for Gagarin, who knows if we would have had the political will to go to the moon. But for the Soviets, so the United States, it was very much a lot of it was done in public view. The Soviet space effort was done in complete and total secrecy. So that accentuated the surprise element, right? That made, I think there's this sort of perfect kind of storm. And Gagarin goes from being one of the most obscure, unknown people behind the Soviet military-industrial complex, gated communities, right? And barbed wire, stay out, it's a secret, to being the most public and recognized person in the world in a matter of seconds. And it was it was a rebirth, right? You can think of it as like exiting the womb, right? Becoming a new person. And so I think the distinctive sort of secretiveness of the Soviet space program, combined with the announcement that we did it, greatly accentuated his fame and his cult, right? And he became, it's like I don't know, maybe this is not a proper way of thinking about it, but, I think about like a woman popping up out of a birthday cake, right? And Gagarin pops up, out of this, and he becomes someone completely unknown to the most famous person in the world. And I can imagine how disorienting, even more so than the experience of going into orbit, right? That transformation must have been for Gagarin. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine, right? That it must have been so difficult for him as a very young guy, to confront this fame and to deal with the adulation, the worship, the people who want to drink with him, who want to party with him, the women who want to sleep with him, the demands by the politicians that he say the right thing, that he tell the right lies, dealing with his wife, acting like he's a family man, and on and on and on. It's just like, no wonder the guy drank.
It certainly is the double-edged sword of popularity.
And it's a common story, right?
And he gets promoted twice during his hour-long flight. He goes up a lieutenant and he comes down a major. He is entirely a new person and he arrives in an entirely new world.
Yeah. I mean, it really is unprecedented, right? If we think about it, even if we look at the American space program and we look at the Armstrong and and all that stuff, and but it was all sort of it was like a Netflix TV series, right? We saw the first episodes, we saw how it continued, we saw how it culminated. Yay, we won, we got there, and all of that. But here it was just totally a surprise. And by the way, the reason the Soviets did that is because they lacked so much confidence in their own ability to do it. I think they surprised the hell out of themselves that they actually did it. They're like, holy shit. You mean we actually did it? I mean, because think about the disadvantages they had. Devastated country, destroyed, 30 million people died, right? And here they are competing against the richest country in the world to get into space. And they're doing this all in secret. And then they create a copy, but innovate the V2 rocket technology, and they adapt it. Instead of having a nuclear warhead, they put a human being on top of it. This guy, Yuri Gagarin. Well, first they put the poor dog Laika on it, and then Gagarin, and it worked. And I think they surprised the hell out of themselves more than anything that they actually succeeded. So that was, I think that also contributed to the sheer joy and the celebrations that occurred when the Soviet population heard about it. Everyone remembers what they were doing when Gagarin went into space, right? Just kind of like with Kennedy, when Kennedy was assassinated, right? The people at that time, if they were around, right, they remember exactly what they were doing. And those moments bring people together. It creates like a sense of unity and identity that focuses on the person and the event. And that also contributed so much to Gagarin's fame.
And an interesting point you brought up there, I think with the Soviets being as surprised as they were that things went well, is that like there were a lot of near like fatal failures on Vostok 1. Just the fact that like Gagarin, when he lands, he has this almost again, this almost pseudo-religious way of being found, where he lands in a field next to some farmers and he leads a crowd of people to go and alert the authorities. But that's because the Vostok 1 system, like the spacecraft fails to separate and it starts spinning wildly out of control on re-entry, winds up landing kilometers away from where it's supposed to. But it still winds up reinforcing this story. And you mentioned like all of this fame that he suddenly gets thrown into, these parties at Star City once he becomes so correct me if I'm wrong here, he becomes deputy head of cosmonaut training.
Yes.
And being, I guess, the way he would look at it, the way a lot of this is described, is he's the alpha dog of all of these cosmonauts, because he's still one of them, but he is definitely above all of them.
I think that's true. On the other hand, though, there's I know if you watch what was it with Tom Cruise, Top Gun, right? There's this idea you become this guy that's a trainer, right? But you're not a real pilot, right? You're not up there. You're not getting into the action. So I think that also weared heavily on him, because when he became this famous person and then he segued into being a bureaucrat and an administrator, I think he had a profound sense of no longer being an equal to his fellow cosmonauts going into space, because he was just a paper pusher. And that must have been hard too, because in Russian culture, Soviet culture, being a paper pusher is like being a loser, right? You got to be a man of action. You got to be engaged in some sort of glorious enterprise and signing papers and appearing at events and cutting ribbons and all that other crap, right? That was humiliating for him, right? So yeah, I agree with you that he had sort of like a formal kind of privilege and status, but it came at the expense of being able to continue the glorious enterprise of flying into space. And that must have worn on him, right? Like some athlete who, Michael Jordan in his late years or whatever, just like he can't do it anymore, right? And although Michael Jordan doesn't lapse into alcoholism and the same things that happened to Gagarin. So I guess that doesn't quite hold up, but you get what I mean, I think.
Yeah. I wonder then if, I'll say his wilder antics around Star City. I wonder if some of that is kind of was built around making sure that everybody knew he was still A, one of the boys, and that he was B, above all of them because he had been first. With Star City, like he turns it into the party city, not just for the cosmonauts, but it becomes the happening place to be for all of these Soviet politicians and poets and musicians who drive all the way out from Moscow to visit and attend these prestigious parties.
Yeah, I think that was partying was a way that he could maintain the aura, the magic, the charisma associated with his feat, right? As opposed to signing papers, right? One of the things that he did after he became this famous person is then he became a deputy to the Supreme Soviet, right? This kind of the equivalent of Congress, but with only one person on the ballot. And it's selected by the Communist Party. And so he represented his home district. And so when I visited the city where he grew up, he had an office and in the home where his parents lived. And they have the Soviet car that they gave him encased in glass as a result of being rewarded for his feat. And what did he do there? So that in this house museum, they have a picture of his desk where he signed papers. And I thought, how sad, right? That you go from being a cosmonaut to a person who sits at a desk and signs papers. It just must have been soul killing. As I have no other way of thinking of it. Certainly not glorious, right? But that's what happens when you go into space. You got to come back.
The dweebification of Russia's manliest man.
Yeah.
Definitely something we can talk about because as he's doing this political networking and as he's setting up these parties, he runs into someone called Sergei Pavlov, who's the head of Komsomol. And this is probably my favorite part of your book is learning about how he basically gets, correct me if I'm wrong here, recruited by Pavlov to be like the manly man Russian example and to fight the Styliagi.
Yeah.
I'm probably mispronouncing that.
No, yeah, that is Styliagi. Yeah, no, that's good.
Okay. So can you kind of explain for us what Pavlov's deal was and how he got Gagarin on side for this?
So, yeah, the Komsomol, the Communist Youth Organization, so this happened in the early 1960s under Khrushchev. He's like, okay, we don't have a religious code of ethics anymore, but we need to be ethical in some way. This is the whole theme of Khrushchev's condemnation of the Stalin crimes, right? That there is as he put it, communist morality. And so here again, the connection to religion, right? Using Gagarin as this sort of example of how you should conduct yourself as a proper human being. An ideal communist, but someone who doesn't lie, right? Who tells the truth, who is a faithful sort of supporter of comrades, right? Who is patriotic and all these other kinds of things, hardworking, sober. And so Pavlov's mission was to use Gagarin as a kind of, in the same way, I suppose, as Nike and other companies use the athletes in our country as role models, right, to sell their products. In this case, Pavlov is using Gagarin as a role model to sell the political system. That's the product that they're selling. And so Gagarin was subjected to becoming an ideal person, which he, of course, was not. This was even illustrated to me. This continues when I did my research in Saratov, where he studied metalworking before he became, entered into the military and then became a pilot and eventually part of that early cosmonaut group. There was a competition every year in Saratov that continues to this day after the Soviet Union collapsed to write an essay that talks about Gagarin as a model human being, a model Russian. And so when I went there, that was in 2008, I believe. And so I went to the museum in Saratov devoted to Gagarin. And so the woman proudly displayed who ran the museum, the essay that won that year. And the essay was devoted to how Gagarin was emblematic of a sober, clean style of living, which was, of course, contrary to all those partying and everything else that he did. But that was like, people preferred like that there was that tension between, that the heroic image that he had to manifest and the reality of his everyday life, which was so different. And I mean, I have no, because I'm not famous. None of us are famous. So we don't have to live up to other people's demands other than our wives or boyfriends or girlfriends or parents or whatever. And that's kind of trivial, right? We can just say, fuck you, right, to them. But Gagarin couldn't say fuck you to Pavlov, right? He couldn't just say, screw it. I'm just going to do my own thing. I think some of the American cosmonauts astronauts got into a little bit of hot water because they're like, I want to do my own thing. You mentioned Borman, right? But there were others, right? That just couldn't stomach the bullshit. But Gagarin had to stomach it. He had to deal with it. And that must have created all sorts of conflicts and traumas.
Yeah, and something to kind of go off of that, you mentioned Gagarin kind of having to learn to both adapt to this new kind of political world that he finds himself in, as well as having to that he is not totally in control of both his own image and his own, responsibilities and actions. That he has to be able to stomach this and hold his tongue sometimes. Was this a learning period for Gagarin, or was he always this kind of adept political animal that he seems to be?
Yeah, I think that the release that Soviets had from being these adept political animals, and here I'm maybe going off on a limb, is drinking and partying. So the function, psychologically speaking, of partying was to sort of escape the prison of the expectations that political system had put upon you. And it became almost like a kind of, like in New Orleans when you have the, for a day you can act out, you can dress like a woman if you're a man, et cetera, right? That when there's a party, it's okay to be disruptive and to say things that are not proper. And so that was the way that Gagarin dealt with the pressures and of having to live up to a particular image that he knew he couldn't live up to, that no one could live up to. It was the hypocrisy and lying of the system, right? And we have our own form of hypocrisy and lying in our own system that we're expected to live up to certain expectations. Our heroes, right? We see that they're not like we think they are. And for them, that must create all sorts of traumas and tensions. But Gagarin was I really sympathize with him because I think that he was thrust into a hopeless position of being a model, and he had no preparation for it. He was so young, and I don't think he had any idea what he was getting into. No one did. He was just like an accidental phenomenon that became like a foundation of what it means to be Russian all of a sudden. And Jesus, I don't know what that would be like.
Yeah. It does seem from your book that he did seem to definitely exploit some of the elements of his fame. That while you are right that he was thrust into this situation where he was completely out of his depth, like fixation on rank and uniform, it sounds like he kind of turns Star City not just into this party center, like he demands that they build the insertion between the cosmonaut apartments just so that they can, party more without having to go outside. Correct me if I'm wrong here. He seems to take his political obsession with hierarchy and rank and apply it to everything in Star City, where everything is super stratified. In your book, you describe a system where, based on the number of medals you have and the number of flights you've done, you get more and more luxurious apartments, which are still way more than the average Soviet citizen would get. And even like the lowliest worker at Star City is earning much more money than anywhere else or living much better. But it's still, you walk into this city and it's almost this dystopia dreamt up by a guy my age, a guy younger than me.
That's a really good point. And I'm going to say something kind of strange maybe, and maybe I'm showing my age. But when I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, I would watch reruns of a show called The Jeffersons, which was a spinoff of the All in the Family. So there was this black family, right? And Archie Bunker and All in the Family didn't like because he was a racist. He didn't like Mr. Jefferson, who was an entrepreneur, right, and an aspirer. And so the spinoff, The Jeffersons, is about this family that's moving on up. That was the theme song to the east side, right, to the better side of the city, and in New York, right, and had outdone the white person, the working class Archie Bunker person. And Mr. Jefferson is kind of a dick, right, and he's very much sort of aware that he is. He wants people to know that he's superior to them. At the same time, he's like aware that he's operating in a world where he's always not going to have power, that the power exists somewhere else. And I think Gagarin was in a similar situation, right? When you feel powerless, I guess one of your responses is to try to impose your will on those below you. And I think Gagarin did that, not necessarily because he had a bad character, but because that was the system, right? There's a hierarchy. There's a certain standard for whether or not you make it. You live in a gated community. You get a special apartment. You have special food and all the rest of it. You get a special car, all that kind of stuff. By the Soviet definition, that was the Soviet dream, right? And he was realizing it. At the same time, I think he understood that maybe he didn't deserve it, right? Or that it wasn't quite fair in some way. But maybe we all do that, right? I mean, I get a salary as a university professor, and what do? I just sit here and talk on podcasts, and I write books about shit that interests me. And somehow I get paid for that, right? That doesn't seem fair. I mean, you guys should get paid for this podcast, right? You should be rich as a result of it, but you don't, right? So,
folks, you have heard it here first. We're setting up a Patreon. The expert has agreed that you should make us rich, so get on that. This will be going out to the world. But it is a kind of fair point that you bring up, where I hadn't really thought of it like that, that maybe because the instant Gagarin steps out of Star City, he is no longer in control. He's being sent off to deliver a speech that someone else has written. He's being sent off around the world to do this and that. So, like, Star City is the one area that he can control, his one little island where he does have a say in what he can do, and he seems to both cling to that and exploit it. And it is kind of a fair point you talk about. I think everybody has their area that they like to keep kind of control or keep tidy, something that they like to have control of as a sense of stability. I like to think that if I were in that situation, I wouldn't take it as far as Gagarin did, or give it such a weird kind of, I don't want to say uniform fetishist, but the book definitely does, like, from reading your book and other books on Gagarin, he definitely does seem to have like a fixation with uniforms. You describe that he trialed new experimental uniforms whenever he went to Cuba. Like, he made sure that he always had the best and coolest new things to wear.
You know, I really love that observation about uniforms. And one of the things that fascinates me about Russian culture, thinking about the history as well that I've studied, is the obsession that Russians have with uniforms, with medals, which are like a way of displaying your status relative to other people. And, in the United States, it's not so much, right? I mean, we see people get on planes with their uniforms on and all that kind of stuff. But, and it's like, okay, yeah, we respect your service, and you can go on the plane first, that kind of thing. But there isn't that kind of, we step back and sort of let these people take over kind of mentality. But in Russia, a person who wears a uniform is a really respected person, or at least maybe until recently. And Gagarin was into the medal thing. And by the way, the medals, right? The military parades in the Soviet Union after World War II began, particularly in the 1960s. It intensified. That you showed your worth by how many medals you had on your chest, man. If you got like 60 fucking medals on your chest, you were like there, right? And everyone worshipped you and they thought, oh my God, the heroic sacrifice, the martyrdom for the motherland, blah, 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 right? So I think that Gagarin was also sort of like steeped in that culture. And so the obsession with hierarchy, with rank, with uniform, with medals, right? And all this stuff comes out of the culture that he grew up in. It makes sense that he would obsess in that way. I mean, he wasn't a rebel.
And definitely, like, with even while he is being propped up as this he didn't fight in the war figure for like a new generation of Soviet youth, he himself would have still grown up hero worshiping all of these soldiers, and every single depiction of those soldiers is them with, enough medals on their chest that they're basically bulletproof. So yeah, kind of circling back to Pavlov a little bit, was that depiction what really landed with kids?
What an excellent question. I think that culture is really messy this way. I mean, I do a lot of cultural history, and culture is messy, right? First of all, it's messy. Where does it come from? And then what is the message that like cultural tropes, icons, and images project, and how do people receive them? And I think it's a really complex question. So the intent was to make Gagarin, Pavlov's intent, to be this ideal kind of sober, self-sacrificing kind of martyring figure for the homeland, for the motherland. That was the intent. But I think that Russia had developed after World War II, particularly by the mid 1960s, and there was the intrusion of Western culture, of pop icons, the Beatles by the late mid 1960s, and also Western forms of dress and leisure and consumer society, cars, like all this stuff became a fascination. And so simultaneously, right, as Gagarin manifests the traditional sort of World War II figure, he also represents something that has moved beyond that actually connects Gagarin in some ways with people like Elvis, that it just represent having a good time and enjoying yourself, and not necessarily having it connected with service, right, to the motherland. Although I get back to Elvis, right? What legitimized Elvis is that he, in some ways, he did those movies where he represented himself as a service person, right? At the same time that he was his drug taking, like a womanizing hot guy, right? So that I see an awful lot of similarities in some ways, and I don't think that the Gagarin was not the cult of Gagarin was not controlled and dominated as much by the state as the state wanted to, and that Gagarin had some agency in creating an image of himself that went beyond what Pavlov had envisioned. And in part, that was also a result of the fact that the younger Russian population was hungering for someone who was not that kind of sterile, self-sacrificing martyr of World War II. Someone who could enjoy life, in other words, and smile, and have a good time, and party. That was a new thing in Russia after the horrors of World War II, and Gagarin embodied that at the same time, of course, that he embodied the earlier images of self-sacrificing martyrdom.
So was that something that Gagarin kind of took upon himself to try and get kids to do, get people to think about? Because I'd seen all this footage, but I'd never really thought of it until now, that whenever Gagarin goes out and water skis, is he the guy who's bringing along the camera crews, get people to film him water skiing? Or is that other propaganda officials wanting to depict him that way?
I must admit, based on my sources, because they're quite curated, let's put it that way, by the archivist, it's kind of difficult to tell. My guess, my hunch would be that Gagarin had a lot to do with it, because he was an active sportsman. That was expected as part of his persona, official persona, but it was also something that he embraced. And so I imagined that that was something that, kind of exploitation of his cult that he wanted, that he felt good about, as opposed to signing the papers for another building Communist Party central headquarters in his hometown of Gazhatsk, right? That must have been incredibly soul-killing in some ways. But to be featured as a water skier and to have that be okay, right, as a healthy communist activity, I imagine that was really gratifying for him. That he kind of gave back in a way that, you know, professional athletes in the NBA and the NFL, right? They have these charities and they try to encourage kids to be healthy and to have healthy diets and all that kind of stuff. You know, we can look at that cynically and say it's a bunch of bullshit and hypocrisy, right? Look at what they really do in their lives. But on the other hand, you know, maybe it was something that they genuinely believed in and promoted. And, you know, like you said before, Gagarin was a complex guy. He could be 2 or 3 different things at once.
And one thing you mentioned there, you said that it was okay that he was doing this, and that it was an accepted and cool communist practice. But in your book, you also make a good point of talking about the pushback that Gagarin got, like where these different depictions of him clashed, and him going out and water skiing and then having to deal with, either at a party or in a newspaper, some crusty old general basically saying, like, you know, a hero of the Soviet Union shouldn't be out there water skiing, or criticizing him, I think, for being a dandy is what they said, because of his obsession with these clean pressed uniforms. So can you describe kind of the pushback? Like, was that pushback coming from just individual Soviet officials, or was that a representation of the system itself trying to push back?
Yeah. I mean, I'm now an old fart officially, but, you know, I used to be a young person, and I remember confronting old farts and their attitudes, right? And you would offend them by trying to do certain things. But I think that what I admire about Gagarin is his ability to use his celebrity to resist at some level, a minor level perhaps, the old farts, right? So he was supposed to drive, right, the Soviet-made car that he was gifted after his flight. But the one that he really loved to drive was the one that he couldn't talk about, but he nonetheless drove it. And that was the French-made Matra, right, which was the first fiberglass sports car. And the French aerospace company Matra gifted that to him. That was the one he really drove. Of course, that's not the one that's encased in glass in his hometown. But he could do that, right? Other people couldn't do that because they didn't have his fame, his celebrity, his accomplishment. And so he leveraged it to in some ways to give the finger to the old farts, right? And in that way, I guess he's sort of a rebel, but in a way that made him not a dissident. It didn't push him outside the power structure. He knew what the limits were. And that's I think we all do that, right? Unless we go off the deep end and then we get, you know, punished. But we all sort of test the limits, or at least some of us do. And then when we see that if we do that, that's going too far and we're going to screw ourselves, we retreat. And I think Gagarin had a real skill for knowing how to push the limits, but when to retreat so he could maintain his position as a part of, you know, the traditional Soviet communist power structure. And that's what makes him so fascinating, right? I'm not really interested in people as an historian who are rebels and dissidents, because actually they're few and far between. I'm interested in the people that live within the system and how they do it, right? And how they test the limits of it, how they push it and expand it. And Gagarin had sort of like, he had super potential, right? I often imagine, what would he have become if he had not died at such a young age, at the age of 34? Maybe I'd be really disappointed. He'd be this fat guy with a, you know, gigantic beer gut, ultra reactionary, kind of pathetic figure, maybe bald, but who knows, right? We don't want to see our heroes as real life people.
Me being as cynical as I am, I think he'd probably wind up kind of in the situation of Valentina Tereshkova or Svetlana Savitskaya. So he'd be he'd be a Duma member for United Russia, or he'd be like a war blogger or something like that.
I agree. But who knows? Maybe he'd be like in prison. No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
His daughters, by the way, are very much connected to the Putin regime, and so one of his daughters is the head of the museum administration in the Russian Federation, which is a hugely powerful position, and the other is an academic, an anthropologist. But so they have good positions, right? And they've leveraged the Gagarin fame in order to promote themselves, project themselves into positions of power, relatively speaking, in the context of Russia today.
And not just leveraged their father's fame, but also like actively participated in the cult. You saw this with a lot of Gagarin's family, with the exception of his father, notably. Anna Gagarina was a very active participant in the cult, and everybody who has, all of his family members who have used it have also had to keep up the lies. So it must be such I don't want to say interesting, but like a weird position to be in, where you owe your career to your father's achievements, but you also have to consistently lie about your father and tell people the idealized culty. He was a perfectly sober man who never partied, never did anything like that. He was a strong Russian nationalist, nothing else.
I think that's what makes him fascinating to Russians as well, because Russians aren't stupid. They recognize the lies they have to tell in order to get by and to maintain their position. So at the same time that they're, maintaining the fiction, they're also, with a wink and a nod, sort of understanding, right, that it's more complex than that. So you can have your cake and eat it too. I guess we all do that with our families, right? I've been thinking about my mother and my father and, the stuff that happened over the years, right? And I've maintained all sorts of untruths about how I was raised in order to avoid confronting the reality of how I was raised, right? And what I went through. I mean, I'm not saying my parents are abusive or anything like that, but I'm just, it's just like we human beings have, I think we're wired to sort of reject those things about our own past, our own family that contradict the happy story. And even more so if the happy story, maintaining it provides benefits, financial, social, political.
And in your opinion, then, what would have been the situation with Gagarin's father, Alexei? Because it seems like he, contrary to all of these other people who went along with the lies in order to advance their own positions or just to survive, he seems to have completely rebelled against all of this. Like, he hated the French car, he hated the flamboyance, he hated the fact that the town was renamed after his son. I think in the book you also mentioned that he was a devoted follower of Khrushchev as opposed to Brezhnev. There's even like a kind of traditionalist political element thrown in there.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? The father-son conflict, that's so epic, right? And almost like Old Testament. And I was always struck by, the clash between the son and the father, in the way that the memory of the father is erased in favor of the loving, supporting, doting mother. And so the father disappears, right, and is erased. Although maybe I'm reading too much into this. The time period, the context for this is the attack on the father cult of Stalin. And so, fathers are not popular, father cults, right? And there's sort of reaction against that as the sort of expression of a revolutionary spirit. And so the son sort of bests the father, and the mother is the one that makes the son successful and powerful. And the father disappears from the narrative, from the screenplay. And that's exactly what happened to Stalin, right? He kind of disappears. He becomes the elephant in the room. The father of Soviet rocketry, by the way, was Stalin. He was the one that committed the resources for Korolev to develop from the V-2 rocket technology that they had seized at the end of World War II, a viable rocket technology that could provide strategic nuclear capability and ultimately produce Laika, Sputnik, Laika, and then Gagarin, Tereshkova, Leonov, and so on and so forth. And then that whole history gets eliminated. The father's gone, right? And Gagarin's father, Stalin, the father's gone, and Gagarin's father is gone. He's like purged. And that I'm not sure what to make of that, right? But it's a really interesting phenomenon.
And before, you talked about the difference between the American and the Soviet programs as being like a Netflix series, where with Gagarin, it's kind of like you've just been given the season finale, and then all of these reviews are coming out, and everybody's saying how much they loved the whole season, and you're left kind of sitting here like, well, like, where was that? What was the lead up to this? I'm just being given the final minute and being told, like, just being left to fill in the blanks. You mentioned Anna as well, his mother, his doting mother. And in the book, you talk about this kind of cargo cult type of parenting that starts to crop up, where people start to look at Gagarin and they think like, all right, well, if I raise my kids the same way that Anna Gagarina raised her kids, then they are, 1-to-1. The equation is going to match up perfectly. They're going to be Gagarins. They're going to wind up being just like Yuri. It gets to the point where people learn to play the exact same games that Gagarin played as a kid. They have to copy every element of his childhood down to like the minute. And as well as writing his father out of the history, they also write his brother out of history for not being as perfect, because his brother is living proof that Anna Gagarina's parenting equation didn't always produce Yuri Gagarin's.
Yeah, that's a great question. And also Boris, right? His brother and another brother and sister, right, that were taken into German captivity during World War II. So the shame of that is associated actually not so much with the mother, but with the sheer fact that the territory where Gagarin grew up was occupied by the Germans. And that was the biggest elephant in the room that the biographers, official ones, couldn't confront. Because according to the Stalinist logic, so here's where the cult of Gagarin kind of like defies the standard political logic of the time. If you lived in a territory that was occupied by the Nazis, you were automatically suspect, regardless of anything that you did, of being a Nazi collaborator and sympathizer. So the fact, this is one aspect of Gagarin's biography that perhaps his handlers didn't take into account, that he lived under occupation and Nazi occupation. So in order to confront that, they had to concoct a few stories. First of all, they had to eliminate the story of his brother, who hanged himself eventually, and who was abused by an SS guy that in that area. And then they had to create this bogus story about little Yurichka, being a rebel, right, and trying to sabotage the Nazi SS people in the village, all of which I'm sure is absolute bullshit. Yeah, it just didn't happen, and but that was the only way that they could deal with the elephant in the room, because at that time, to live under Nazi occupation, as most of Ukraine had been, was to be a second-class citizen after the war, because now Stalin and then later on Khrushchev and Brezhnev said, well, if you were under Nazi occupation, that meant you weren't a resistor the way people who weren't under Nazi occupation were. So that was the one really troubling part of Gagarin's biography, that he had this experience of living under Nazi occupation. And people must have recognized that, but the official biographies allied all of that. And then the story of his brother, it kind of appears a little bit here and there, but it's really interesting.
Which is also wild, because like, of the story of Yuri Gagarin that I read, like the part where I sympathized most with him of all of it was his genuinely brutal childhood of living under Nazi occupation and all of this stuff that happens to this family. Whereas, like you describe, whenever it comes to the official story, they have to get rid of that. They have to turn him into like a junior partisan
Yes,
in order to
exactly.
scrub away the shame of not having fought at Stalingrad at the age of like 4.
Yeah, I like that.
So he dies in 1968 in a, like you say, a routine kind of flight accident. And today this is known for basically spawning hundreds and hundreds of what I consider to be dumb conspiracy theories of, oh, maybe he was shut up for this and this. Maybe he was going to spill the beans on what really happened to Komarov.
Or he was hunting and he was drunk. He took a plane flight and he was drunk.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and he was hunting from shooting elk or something or moose from the plane.
Shooting at the window. Could you just, so whenever that happens, whenever he crashes, what is the reaction from both like the people, the propaganda, and the state in the immediate aftermath? Like, do they try and cover it up? Do they come clean?
Oh, the immediate aftermath is cover up. That's the go-to. I mean, if we think about like Kobe Bryant, right, when he wrecked in that helicopter, right? And in the American system, the first thing that happens is that the cops who were there who took pictures try to sell the pictures and make money.
Jesus.
In the Soviet system, the response is, let's cover this thing up, man. And so they had an investigation. It was totally secret. And they said nothing, which only, of course, spawned all sorts of conspiracy theories about what had happened. And I think it's the silence of the system and its inability to confront actually the reason it happened was because of incompetence with the air traffic controllers that produced this area, this vacuum that was filled by conspiracy theories, alien abduction, drunk on a hunting trip, et cetera, et cetera. And there are just dozens and dozens of different versions. And so here's an illustration of where the state's inability to come clean actually creates a situation that produces this conspiracy theory realm that the state can't control and combat. And it's existed to this day. Of course, we're quite familiar with conspiracy theories in our own world. It's hard to contain them, man, because the proof that a conspiracy theory happened is that there's no proof because the conspirators destroyed it. So there's no way you can argue against a conspiracy theory. And that's the case with all the conspiracy theories about Gagarin, as with Apollo, right? That it was a Hollywood stage thing, the landing on the moon and all that. Oh, the proof is they destroyed the film. They destroyed the evidence. They killed the people who were part of the conspiracy. That's the proof.
Right. We just recently finished a series on the story of Soyuz 1 and Vladimir Komarov. I feel like that's also an unfortunate one because the conspiracy theories have generally won, and that a lot of people believe. Before we did that series, I believed all of the dumb conspiracies. A lot of that spawned out of the Soviet government not coming clean, not telling the truth. So they left all this blank space in the story that conspiracy theories just slot right into, and they tell the story that the government won't.
I think it's absolutely true, right? I mean, I think about the maps from like the 1500s and 1600s of Europe, and so they had the known world that was mapped, and then they had this vast world that was on the edges. And on the edges of these maps, you would see all sorts of sea creatures and monsters and gargoyles and stuff. And so in the uninhabited spaces or unexplored spaces, that's where the monsters are, right? And so when you have this like information vacuum that gets filled with these monster conspiracy theories, and there's nothing you can do to combat it. It takes on a life of its own. And if you try to tell people that they're wrong, they'll just say, you're part of the conspiracy.
Like you said, there's no way to argue out of that. Any lack of evidence, even if you present evidence to like that counters a conspiracy theory, it will just be taken as like, oh, you faked that. That's not real. So carrying the story of Gagarin forward to the modern era, or at least into the start of the Russian Federation, during Glasnost, Perestroika, during the period where an independent media starts to open up and appear in Russia, of course, before it gets kind of tamped down in the later years, that Gagarin, the story starts to shift a little bit. Like people start to look at him a little bit more. It's okay to call him a raging drunk. It's okay to call him a party animal now. Is that something that was kind of officially condoned by the state? Was that just a symptom of the more media freedom coming up?
So if I think about this in the context of like the development of Russian history in the late Soviet era, let's say 1988, 89, 90, and then into the post-Soviet era, and then the Putin era, they're kind of like some, because I'd been in Russia numerous times throughout these periods. And so in the late 1980s, 89, 90, I was in Moscow as a student. And anything went, right? There was this contrast between the collapsing economy and system, and then this heady sort of, we're going to reveal all the shit that we couldn't talk about before. And so the press was like all over. I mean, you had all sorts of investigative journalism. Some of it was legitimate. A lot of it was made up, but it was titillating, right? And much of it was like, went to the opposite extreme of besmirching everything that was Soviet. It's all lies, blah, blah, blah. So in the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, entering into the Russian Federation, the drunken Boris Yeltsin, the humiliation of losing the Cold War, the demographic disaster, the drunkenness, the Russian mafia, all the 1990s stuff, right? The corruption. And Putin comes in and he promises to make Russia great again. And so he has this kind of, raga agenda to make Russia great again. And he is consistently sort of put Humpty Dumpty empire back together and national pride back together. And Gagarin's image was central to this. So you had to counter the negative press, the tabloid press, right? The titillating details about his sexual escapades and drunkenness and all that kind of stuff with the heroic image from the 1960s. And that was to be used to reconstruct a sense of Russian national pride. And that project has continued through the 2000s. And, I witnessed like the reconstruction of the positive Gagarin cult in 2008, 2009. And now it's sort of like back to the Soviet Pavlov image that we talked about before, the ideal sort of human being, the sober human being, right? And so that's where we are now. Of course, all bets are off with this damn war.
Yeah. Quick question then. In your opinion, was there a period of time, or what was the period of time with the healthiest propaganda perception of Gagarin? Because you describe in like the early periods where it goes full cult, and then by the time of Perestroika, tabloids take it 200% in the other direction into like he was nothing but a drunken, raging party animal, and then Putin's Russia takes it all the way back to the 60s. Like, was the period in between the kind of 70s and 80s, was that a more kind of healthy, moderate image of Gagarin?
Well, I think that, what happened in the 1970s and 80s with the space program is they kind of turned Gagarin into like the George Washington of space, right? So he became this mythical sort of the Christopher Columbus, that would be the better way to put it, of space. And so his image was kind of like flattened and, made devoid of any kind of significant content, positive or negative, and just simply turned into the Christopher Columbus of space. And the Soviets had a lot of things to be proud of, even though they got their asses beaten to the moon. They had they developed a significant low Earth orbit capability. They made all sorts of feats and records through the 70s and 80s with length of people in space. They had international missions with fellow communists from Eastern Europe, from Cuba, from Vietnam, et cetera, from the Arab world. And And so Gagarin just became like the Christopher Columbus of all this, like one step and feet after another. I think that's so the 70s and 80s kind of avoided the question of who he was and what he actually did by simply turning him into like this Christopher Columbus figure. That's how I would, off the top of my head.
So instead of viewing him and having to kind of think of who he was as a person, he would just be the next one in line of Sputnik, Laika, Gagarin, Tereshkova. You don't really need to delve in. Everybody knows who they are. You don't need to do a lot of research into it. He's just the next one in line. And then let's move on and talk about all of the, the Salyut stations and all of the recent stuff.
That's very much true. And so I had a student who did a really excellent thesis, master's thesis this year on biography of Alexei Leonov, who was a good friend of Gagarin and who did the investigation into his death. He died a couple years ago, but he lived a long life, unlike Gagarin, and he became like Gagarin after he did the first spacewalk in 1965. And then he was the lead commander on the Apollo-Soyuz test project in July of 1975. He was trainer of cosmonauts, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, he became an entrepreneur. He ran Alpha Bank, which was a big bank, and then he underwrote and financed a film about his own flight, the spacewalk flight, which was a dramatic. I mean, there was all sorts of stuff that happened on that flight, including landing in Siberia and facing bears, and I mean, all sorts of stuff. And one of the things that Leonov did is that he tried to create his own cult in his own political career, and he was a lot savvier than Gagarin was. He could speak. He taught himself to speak English. Gagarin had no foreign language ability. After Gagarin, they all had to be able to speak English, and Leonov was the one that made that happen. So one of the things that Leonov did in the 70s and 80s, and even through the 90s, is he refocused cosmonautics on himself and his own career. And I think the attention went away from Gagarin. And Leonov, in addition, was the person who claimed to have secret information about why Gagarin actually died in that plane flight in 1968. And he shepherded that. So there was a kind of a lapse there. And then when in the Putin era, the Gagarin cult really made a comeback.
God damn it! That's another I feel like that's another don't meet your heroes moment, because up till now I thought Leonov was one of the good ones, until it turns out that, oh no, he was also actively involved in building up his own cult and detracting from the achievements of other cosmonauts. But yeah, you do bring it back to Russia under Putin, and Gagarin's kind of reassertion as the main, not just as the first man in space, but as this model of like the perfect Russian man, the guy that everyone should live up to. In the book, I believe you talk about Gagarin clubs coming back with the express intent of raising up kids to be more like him, to achieve the same kind of things he did. Is this something that you have seen continually ramping up? Is this cult going to get bigger and more assertive, or has it kind of peaked?
This is where I can invoke what historians always claim, and that is, I'm an historian, I'm not a future caster. The only thing I know about the future is it never turns out the way the historical actors think it will turn out. But having said that, I think the Gagarin is a fixture of Russian national identity. That's not going to go away. He's a kind of palimpsest, right? A blank slate. And people can write into it, as with Jesus Christ, right? The image of themselves that they project through their hero, right? And like the ideal image of themselves. And I think that that's kind of like, that's not going to go away. That's an aspect of Russian culture. It will continue. And so that's a guarantee that the cult of Gagarin will continue, but it's going to change according to the needs and demands of Russia in the present, right? The way politicians exploit it, but also the way people on the ground and the places he came from, the journalists and so forth during the jubilees of the flight, right? They'll rewrite his biography. Sometimes they'll include new details. Sometimes they'll just reprint the same old shit, right? And but that's going to keep it alive, and I don't think it's going to go away. No, I think it's like he's up there with Alexander Nevsky in Russian history, with Rasputin, and Stalin. I think he's like one of those go-to iconic figures in Russia that's going to stay in people's minds in Russia for a long, long time.
So with that in mind, as far as like big Russian historical figures to call back on and the decision of when to use which one for what situation, what has, and this might not be like the go-to for a lot of Russian propaganda, but specifically with the war in Ukraine and Russia's current, I guess, revanchist policies towards post-Soviet publics, what has made Gagarin an element that you could call on? Because his achievements at the end of the day was he was the first man into space. So in 2011, it was Gagarin, we fucked up. In 2021, it was Gagarin, we did it. And on April 12th, 2022, Putin goes to Vostochny and he talks about how Russia's invasion is a parallel to Gagarin's flight while denying the Bucha massacres at the same time. Like, what is the link that makes, of all of those Russian historical figures, that makes Gagarin the most applicable to a imperialist war of aggression?
Yeah. I mean, everything, what you said, it just indicates that you put it quite well. The ludicrousness of the lack of coherence, put it that way. If we think about the function of cults and the political messages that they convey, but that's the way it is with political cults, right? They're not coherent. They're driven by passion and emotion, and they can be filled up with whatever message you want if you're skilled enough at creating that message. And, so like I said, in the book, and I say this all the time about Gagarin himself, right? The person he was in the cult, the people that worship him and what they put into the image of him are two totally separate things. And I think that Gagarin is one of those figures that is in that rarefied air of being able to be continually filled up with whatever people want him to be. Kind of like Jesus Christ, right? Or kind of like, I don't know if Trump is the right thing, right? But there are certain people that are palimpsest, right? And blank slates, and you can just like write onto them your own identity and associate that with something great and patriotic and national. And I can't quite describe in an objective scientific way why that's the case. But as an historian, I have that sense about Gagarin that he's in the pantheon, man, of Russian historic figures that are mythological.
He does seem kind of like a tragic figure because he has this incredible legacy. But like you said, because he's a blank slate, everybody in the world knows one single fact about Yuri Gagarin, and that's that he was the first man in space. And then everything else that they know about him is likely to be a lie in one direction or the other. Either he's like a raging drunk or he's completely sober. Either he's a party animal or he's completely faithful. It's black and white, where, like you talk about in your book quite frequently, Yuri Gagarin is a very complicated man, and it's this sea of grays in every single factor about him. And very frequently, he went back and forth between them. He didn't have to be, completely one or the other.
Yeah. I like this point that you made. It made me think of something that I've often thought about, and that is what makes a cult so powerful is that you can construct it yourself. You become an agent. So this became apparent to me when I was in Saratov at the museum devoted to Gagarin's time there. Saratov was a place where he studied metalworking and then got involved in a sort of the becoming in there, learning how to fly a plane, and then eventually got noticed into the military. But that was when he was a completely obscure human being and not known by anyone. And so when he went to this to Saratov, he became in so many different ways a different guy, because he realized that he could manipulate people by taking photographs of himself and representing it. He saw himself as a photographic object using photographic technology. And I always thought about that, right? It's like, what does it mean to see yourself as if you're another person? It's like ideal training to be a social media star or a podcast superstar, right? But he had that rare ability. I think that, it wasn't coincidental that he became a cult.
I guess that is kind of a fair point. The the third option, the thing that we have not considered of what Yuri Gagarin might be in today's day and age, is a social media influencer or a very weird podcaster. The headspace that you have to put yourself into to have these multiple plates spinning, to know that like on Tuesday, I'm going to have to be Gagarin, the athlete. And then on Wednesday, I'm going to have to fly halfway around the world and I'm going to have to be Gagarin, the Soviet Superman. And then I come home and Pavlov's going to make me, Gagarin, the Russian, country dude. I'm half amazed he didn't like let the script slip or accidentally deliver the wrong speech to the wrong people. Maybe he did. Maybe it just never made it into the record. Because like I have enough trouble keeping my simple life on track, having to do all that while also running Star City and, keeping control of all of his weird, hazing rituals.
Well, one thing I wanted to add that you omitted, I mean, I understand why you omitted it because he had so much shit to do. It's like being a father, a husband, that had to be added into the mix, right? And I think that in some ways, something no one ever talks about, particularly his wife, right, and his children, maybe was the biggest challenge that he never was able to confront.
So do you think then he was not able to like adequately, not necessarily provide for the family because they'd have, everything provided for them? Do you think that he failed post-flight, post-mission in being an active and good member of the family?
Well, as a person who's 59 years old and I've been divorced and I have kids, I think he's lucky that he died to not have to deal with that question.
Fair point. And so, yeah, we've taken Gagarin through like the period where he was alive, the various different moods and versions of him that were pumped up or down by propaganda. I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about a kind of version of Gagarin that you, in complete fairness, talk about a lot in your book, but that I didn't talk about with the Chris's or deliver to the audience in our earlier episode, which is in your book, you frequently talk about from Gagarin's biographies and journals, this grappling, this moral grappling he did seem to actually do around the concept of lying and telling the truth. I think in particular, the thing that stuck with me, because I'm Canadian and my ego handled it very well, was he got a letter from a kid in either Toronto or Montreal, I think, that was asking him, like, is it okay to tell a lie under what circumstances? And he's described as like agonizing over this question before giving a very politically Soviet safe kind of answer.
Yeah, that really struck me. But it struck me because I read this book, sort of tongue in cheek, but by a PhD guy, I think at Princeton, and it's called On Bullshit, right? And it makes the great point that there are different degrees of lying, of bullshitting, prevaricating. I mean, all sorts of words we can use for it. And then there are all sorts of justifications for, I mean, even in our own personal lives, why do we lie? Sometimes we think it's a white lie. We justify it that way. So we don't want to hurt someone by telling the truth, or, that there's a greater cause that will be hurt if we tell the truth. So we need to lie for the sake of the ideology or the political movement. I mean, there are all sorts of ways you can justify lying. And I think we're really good at, all of us are good liars. I don't know about you, Quinn, but I've committed a few whoppers over the years, right? And I always manage to justify it in some way, so that I can live with myself. And I think, but for Gagarin, that's like on steroids. He had to do that a lot. And I do imagine he probably confronted, as with that letter to the Canadian kid, that's like, wow, yeah, when is it okay to lie? Right? And that's like a question that we really actually grapple with as academics, as intellectuals, but it's like a big question in politics. I mean, we're seeing that right now. When is it okay to lie? And at what point do you have to come clean regardless of the consequences? And what are the consequences of continuing to maintain the lie? And I imagine Gagarin he thought about that a lot.
Right. And yeah, in complete fairness to him, maybe he would have figured out a better answer over time. Maybe he would have decided to come more clean in on this topic or that topic.
I would have imagined they would have come up with a better lie.
Yeah, just a better justification. Because yeah, I guess you're right. If he had lived, the propaganda would have had to keep going. He would have had to keep playing this role, spinning all of these plates. So he would have just had more time to come up with justifications for why he was continuing to do what he did. Is there ever the potential in the Soviet Union around this period for someone to like fuck up so bad or like break the script so badly that they could have like a political scandal and just be like gone, written out of history, written out of the story, or just disgraced?
I don't think it was possible that like the handlers, and what had been invested in the cult were such that Gagarin could actually fuck up a lot and not have to face consequences. And I think that's also a function of power, right? Is that we mere mortals who are powerless, right? If we fuck up, we're shit canned. But if a cosmonaut fucks up, he's not going to get shit canned.
The way you described the situation, it seems like Gagarin has no way out. He like no matter what he does, he is always going to be entrapped by this propaganda. And I was imagining a scenario where if he had lived, he either intentionally or accidentally could have gotten involved in some big enough scandal that he would no longer be famous or put out in front of people. But then based off of what happened, like he got caught cheating on his wife and drunkenly flung himself out of a window and almost cracked his skull. And all they had to do, all the propaganda had to do, was cover up the scar on his forehead, and that had no consequences aside, obviously, from probably consequences in his family, which was already straining.
I don't know what to say about that. The poor guy, right? He's like he's got a horn dog, man, and he just wants to go for this nurse, and then his wife has to interrupt his situation, and so he jumps out the fucking window. And he cracks his skull, but not enough to kill him, but to deform him. And then he has to present an explanation, not only to his wife, which would be hard enough, right? But also to the world. Jesus. I mean, I don't know what kind of profligate you are, but Quinn, but imagine if you had done that.
I'm hosting you here, and I don't appreciate the tone of that accusation. But yeah, it is. I think if I'm remembering right in the book, the lie that they come up with that I found so hilarious, but also kind of poignant in just like how bullshit it was compared to all of the other lies, is that he got the scar protecting a girl, like diving into a car crash to save her or something. And that's how he wound up with this like scar over his right eye. If you can do that, if you can write that kind of story, and whether or not people actually accept it, I imagine it's the same kind of thing with a lot of like North Korean propaganda, where people don't actually believe the magical stories. But the point of the propaganda is that you have the power to get people to say that they believe it. So if you can do that, if you can make people say that they believe that story, like there's no getting out of that. You are there until you die. And I guess Gagarin was.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. So the way that when you were talking, what I thought about. So when I went to the Museum of Saratov, there were a bunch of museums to him. That's where he studied technical college before he got involved in airplane stuff. And then by coincidence, not intentionally, his capsule landed separately from him. They didn't say that, near Saratov. So that became like a Mecca pilgrimage site. It is to this day for Gagarin. But, he was, I forgot what I was going to say. We've been going on for a little bit here. So I'm trying to figure out what I need to say more.
As the layest of men in here, I feel like this is the most relatable part of the podcast.
Yeah.
With all of that in mind, if you were to talk to someone who had reading a Wikipedia article at best image of Gagarin, what would be the most important things in your mind to deliver? Like one or two bullet points to try and either pierce the propaganda or just give them enough of an insight to then try and figure it out for themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that he became accidentally a famous person, and then he had the dilemma of having no choice but to continue being famous. But at the same time, he kind of liked it and the perks that went along with it. And he realized that he wasn't his own agent, that he had to serve others. And that got really difficult. And he had to negotiate that with a wife that, I don't know, Valentina doesn't seem like that. I have no idea. I shouldn't say, right? But she seems like a pretty strict person. And then he had to deal with his two daughters and then the politicians, the Pavlovs of the world, making the Soviet space enterprise continually be successful. And he was a young guy, and he got crushed, I think, by the demands of fame. And in that way, he's really relatable to all sorts of people that the young people know nothing about Gagarin, the Soviet Union, Russia. This is a 21st century story, in addition to a 20th century story of a person that got crushed by becoming famous and having to deal with all the competing demands of that. And, I don't know. I have no idea how I would deal with it. I don't think I would deal well because I got trivial shit going on and I don't deal with that well.
It does make you wonder if he ever tried to I guess because he was doing propaganda speeches, he couldn't exactly delegate it to anybody. He seems to have had a fun, at least, relationship with his KGB handlers. He seems to have been they were his drinking buddies whenever he was going around the world. And I wonder if some of that was just trying to at least he always had some friends with him, or at least he always I'd hope at least he would have been able to talk to them. But then considering his own beliefs on masculinity and whatnot, I also have to wonder how much self-censoring would have been as a person, if he would have even allowed himself to open up about this stress.
Yeah, secret police people are weird. But they're also they're not only a secret police, but they're like your priest, right? So you could, going back to the religious theme we talked about earlier, you can consider your KGB handlers as your confessors, right? You confess to them, right? And maybe they'll protect you in that way, right? Because they're like bodyguards, but they're also reporting on what you're saying and what you're doing. And I think it's kind of ambiguous, again, I don't have the experience of being surrounded by security and, handlers and all that kind of stuff, and people who might report to others or, protect me, but at the same time control me. That must have been a really difficult world to negotiate. But those are the people closest in his fucking life, right? Even more so than his wife, I bet, and his kids. And so there's got to be a level of intimacy there that goes beyond the political or the cynical calculation, although that's also going on. That's what makes it interesting. It's complex.
With that in mind, I think that's about everything we wanted to go over with you. Chris, are there any questions or notes you wanted to bring up?
I've been brainstorming the hypothetical of if he were still alive now, where do we all think he would be? I know that that's a varied question, right? Because he could be, Quinn, like you said, he could be in the State Duma, or would some unspeakable error have occurred and now he's the head of Roscosmos, so.
Oh God, that would be so much fun. Dude, if he were the Rogozin of the 21st, that'd be amazing. I'd love to see that.
No, I think that he would be a kind of boring person that would be trading, a pathetic sort of person trading on his past fame, and then keenly aware that his life is kind of stopped in a way after his flight, and then he's been trading on that for the rest of his life. That I don't think he could overcome that. That would also be tragic, assuming that he would survive his plane flight. But I'm just being cynical. So, we can come up with an optimistic scenario. He'll become the Prigozhin that will lead mercenary troops against Putin and, overthrow the devil.
and then replace it with his own kind of weird Duganite before Dugan image of how Russia should be. We actually, the episode before this, we did a mini chat on Roscosmos is setting up something called the Uranus Battalion, the Uran Battalion, to try and actively recruit rocket scientists to, go and fight. I don't know, if he were still alive, maybe Gagarin would be leading it. Maybe that would be his Wagner.
Yeah, there are all sorts of possibilities.
It's a wild, wild world. Yes, and the possibilities are truly endless.
Oh, Andrew Jenks, thank you for coming on the show. We really appreciate you chatting with us, answering our dumb questions, and giving our audience a much better understanding of this incredibly weird dude. Because I think even going into this one, I had this idea in my head of like, all right, I'm going to get the expert and he's going to tell me exactly what Yuri Gagarin was in like a 2-word descriptor. Even that's just like, there's no way you can do it. The guy's just too zany, too weird and complex. But thank you for coming on and giving our audience, giving us as much insight as can, be gotten out of this.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed it. And, I have a captive audience here. So that's what we professors and writers like.
It definitely was a session of being blown away in perpetuity, let me say.
Oh my God. Before we even got to the Gagarin stuff, the Apollo, is there, for our audience, is there any place where our audience can find your work?
Well, my recent book, but it's way too expensive and it's a shitty press, but I shouldn't say that. But it's called Collaboration in Space and this Search for Peace on Earth. It's kind of a trite title, but it's about the Apollo-Soyuz test project. And but I have a number of articles that you actually can get free. I mean, that basically more or less are the chapters in that book about Soviet-American collaboration and the whole androgynous docking mechanism thing, and the engineers that can't deal with being, their homophobia makes it impossible for them to accept a docking mechanism that isn't like male-female. So it's got to be androgynous, all that stuff. So I could provide citations.
I'll make sure that all of that is in the description for our audience.
Thank you for listening to Failure to Launch. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review or tell a friend. Everything helps. If you want to follow us, contact us, or suggest a topic, you can email us at launchfailurepodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Twitter at launch_failure. Failure to Launch is hosted on Anchor, and we post on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. We also post our episodes with visual aids on YouTube at Failure to Launch. All music was provided by DJ Danarchy.